Welcome everyone to this wonderful, very and deeply moving exhibit, and what I hope will be a really enlightening panel of discussion. I'm Rabbi Uhrbach, I'm the Rabbi of the Conservative Synagogue of the Hamptons, and I'm also the director of the Block Holker Center for Spiritual Arts at JTS, and I will be moderating our panel today. You might wonder what a rabbi is doing talking about art and activism. And I think there's actually quite a bit of overlap between what I do as clergy and what our panelists do as artists. In the medium in which we work within the human being. Because both religion and art, I think ideally, are what I like to call supra-rational. It speaks, of course, to the mind, but beyond the mind. It functions at a level that we're not always conscious of and affects changes in our being and in the way that we think and see and experience our world, hopefully in all cases for the better, in ways that we may not even be conscious of. And so I hope to explore some of those areas in our discussion today. And before I introduce our wonderful panel, I just want to thank everyone here at the East Hampton Library and the Robert Giard Foundation and my congregation, the Conservative Synagogue of the Hamptons, for co-sponsoring the show and this wonderful evening. And especially I want to thank Jonathan Sillen, who did really all the work in putting it together. And also for sharing with me and with all of us the work of your late partner, Robert Giard. And so I want to thank you for all that you've done. So our panel today, and we have copies of what I'm about to share with you so that you can take them home and look up these really wonderful artists on your own. I hope you will. First starting at that end, working at the forefront of genderqueer visual politics for more than 3 decades. Photographer Lola Flash's work challenges stereotypes in gender, sexual and racial preconceptions. An active member of ACT UP during the time of the AIDS epidemic in New York City, Flash was notably featured in the 1989 Kissing Doesn't Kill poster. Her art and activism are profoundly connected, fueling a lifelong commitment to visibility and preserving the legacy of LGBTQIA+ and communities of color worldwide. Flash's practice is firmly rooted in social justice advocacy around sexual, racial, and cultural difference. Next to her is Kathryn Szoka, a photographer of communities in transition, including Bridgehampton's African American community and the coal region in eastern Pennsylvania. Witness, a recent series, uses landscape imagery as a commentary on contemporary culture. Szoka is represented by the Robin Rice Gallery in New York and teaches photography. She is the co-owner of Canio's Books in Sag Harbor and co-chair of PEER, a multi-issue grassroots organization on the East End. And just to my right is Carlos Sandoval, a filmmaker best known for the Sundance Award-winning film Farmingville. His other films include A Class Apart and the Emmy-nominated The State of Arizona. A sometime lawyer, he is on faculty at the Columbia School of Journalism and writes a monthly column for the East Hampton Press. He is currently at work on a family memoir spanning over 11 generations in what is now the United States. So we're going to be, I'll sit now, and we're going to be having this discussion with the privilege of being surrounded by these extraordinary faces and this beautiful art. And hopefully you'll hear the discussion influenced by these surroundings, and hopefully our discussion will be as well. And I want to begin with the connection, actually, between one of the connections I see between art and religion and activism, which is that they all share a focus on transformation, whether transforming the self or an external reality, or a perspective or a mood. And one of the great challenges associated with transformation or change of any kind is managing loss. And I think on the whole, most of us have some trouble with that. We don't always do it very well. And our difficulty in holding loss is one of the reasons why change, even when it's positive overall or it's just inevitable, is often resisted. And why unwanted or uncontrollable change can lead to fear, anger, and even hate. Bob was photographing writers in the LGBT community during the AIDS crisis. It's a period of great loss in the LGBTQ community, as well as aggressive backlash and prejudice. And I think I'd like to start, Kathryn, with you, because so much, when you describe your work, much of what you write and the work itself echoes what Bob was doing. You speak of photographing communities in transition. I'm thinking of your Life Along the Turnpike series, and the sense of urgency in capturing a landscape being lost. How do you understand the relationship of art to loss and social change or social movements? What's unique about the ability of art to explore and highlight loss and change?
Well, first of all, I'd like to start by thanking Jonathan for being on the panel and the panelists that I'm with, and Rabbi Jan, you. That's a mouthful. My first thought is that I think that imagination is the key to transformation. You talk about transformation, and I think that, you know, art is fueled by the imagination, and therefore the imagination allows us within our art to be able to open up subjects that might be too contentious to deal with if we just speak directly to them, subjects that are hard to tackle. In terms of loss and transformation, you know, first of all, I thought, you know, what does photography really bring to the table, and how does it really enrich a larger subject at hand? With one of the series that I have worked on, which is called Vanishing Landscapes, which documents the transformation of our rural community to a suburban community, I was trying to make visible what was unseen. And I think in many of the work that I do in terms of, you know, photographing communities, it's trying to make visible what people don't look at. You know, whether it's a landscape in a barn that people drive by every day to work and never even notice, or whether it's residents that live in a community that they don't live in and they just drive by and never see anything except maybe they form an opinion about those people that they really know nothing about. So I see that dealing with the loss through art, through photography, is more, it's different. I guess I see it in a way as opening up, as allowing people an opportunity to step inside of a community or a landscape that they are unfamiliar with, and hopefully through that to gain some familiarity with it. I could talk further if you'd like, but...
does anybody else want to share your thoughts about art and the way that art can hold loss? Do you turn to art to deal with loss or impending loss and change? Does it help you?
Well, I mean, for me, thinking about it as a person, as an activist, and growing up through the AIDS crisis, it felt to me like we were kind of experts at loss. And, you know, I graduated from college in 1981, and that was the first year that someone was diagnosed with AIDS. So it feels like as soon as I got out of college, this was what was before me. I almost don't even know how I got into ACT UP. Like, one minute I wasn't in ACT UP, the next minute I was. And so, you know, we did have a lot of anger, we did have a lot of fear, but I think a lot of those emotions were channeled through our direct actions. So there was a way of dealing with all of these immense emotions that, like, I remember talking to my grandma. My grandma at the same time was losing a lot of her friends. So we're both going to funerals at the same time, and it seemed odd that I was doing the same thing as my grandma was, you know? But I think that in the end, through this kind of group spirit that we had with ACT UP, the love that we had for our community members, I feel like that was kind of like this kind of cathartic process that helped with the loss, the numerous funerals, and all those emotions that we weren't really quite, supposedly at our lifetime, we weren't really supposed to be ready for. But I guess because we had this group that was this net of comfort for us, it was a way for us to work through all of those emotions.
Yeah, I sort of want to talk about loss in a somewhat different sense, which is the loss, the transition, or sense of change that can happen within a community. And that's what we confronted when we were dealing with Farmingville, a radical change that was going on, and also in the state of Arizona, where you had this law, SB 1070, which was sort of heinous anti-immigrant law. You had what we really want to do was kind of understand what was agitating people, what was moving that, and try to use art as a way to comprehend and transmit that kind of sense of loss, because it was lost for specific communities. Kyrsten Sinema, who was then a state legislator and is now a senator from Arizona, she said that something that I thought was incredibly profound in understanding what was going on. And she said migrants who had come in to these communities had traveled and prepared themselves emotionally for that change. The people into whose community they came had not. And so that sense of transition, of being in place but having things changed around you, that I thought was a very profound observation, and that's kind of what we try to capture in our films as well.
Yeah, I think very successfully. I mean, having seen the film, there is a way in which the viewer feels and can empathize with the sense of loss that the members in the community are feeling, and can connect it to a loss that I may have experienced, even though I'm not a member of that community. And the film functioned to bridge that. So let me...
Could I just offer one other comment regarding that, looking at loss in a different sense? With the Life Along the Turnpike project that I worked on for several years, there was 3 reasons why the Bridgehampton Museum asked me. And one was they had essentially lost or never had any documentation of the African American community that had lived in Bridgehampton for over a century. And they recognized that they needed the archive to reflect that. So that's another way to look at loss. Another reason for doing it was because it was coming up on the 35th anniversary of a book that was put out called The Other Hampton. I don't know if anyone in the room has seen that, but it was a characterization of the community that the museum felt wasn't wholly accurate, and they felt that their archive should reflect a different aspect. And lastly, the development pressures that were brought to bear that were a big part of my Vanishing Landscapes presentation or series were causing a reverse migration of the citizens, the residents of Bridgehampton, from Bridgehampton back to states where they had come, Virginia and North Carolina. And so they wanted, before that rich history was lost, they wanted to be able to have their photographs and also their oral histories, of which we're still actually working on. So thank you.
I mean, what you're bringing up, I think, also is the sense in which art has an ability to convey that something that is at risk or is being lost is valuable. That when it's portrayed, and I mean, I feel that very much looking around the room, the sense that these portraits convey a sense of love and respect and value for, in this case, a community that was at risk of and was being lost, and what each of you have talked about. So let me just ask you, in general, about the relationship between art and your activism, and how do they inform each other, and are there tensions between how you see yourself as an activist and how you see yourself as an artist in those roles? And has there been a time when, looking back, you feel that your activism compromised your art, or vice versa? That your role as an artist kept you from being the activist you might have wanted to be? I'll just open that to...
Let me just take a stab at that. First of all, I feel I'm more a journalist than an artist, and I still have problems putting that title, artist, to myself. But I think that also trying to draw that line of objectivity is one that I've found really liberating in many ways, but also very limiting in that I constantly try to do that. In my column for the press, I try to be relatively balanced and engage at the community level. So there are ways in which I think that my art has kind of imposed a kind of nuance in there that hasn't allowed for some of the activism I might have engaged in otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I think, for example, of going to the Women's March when I was in Florida, and there, not as a participant, but feeling that if I had a camera in front of me, I could engage more in that way. It allowed me give me some permission to be present without necessarily being the activist.
Yeah.
Well, definitely, I feel like my activism and my art, they're like twins. Not identical twins, you know, they both kind of look and sound a little bit different, but they have the same DNA. So they definitely are, they thrive on each other. But with that said, I think that by being such a committed activist, my art has taken a lot longer to take off. And I've never really, even when I started after art college, you know, I never really was the person who wanted to be like the famous artist. My whole purpose is to just similar, that's why I'm so happy to be here, is that, you know, similar to Robert's, is to show, I mean, he has this quote, "We were here, we existed, this is how we were." And that's what I want to happen with my work, you know, this kind of archive of, you know, marginalized folks who aren't always talked about. So in that sense, I think that it's taken a long time because, you know, you don't go to many museums and galleries where you see a lot of queer work. You see work by queer artists of things that aren't particularly queer. And I'm not making judgments on other artists who choose to not do work around their identity. But I feel like, in my case, like, who better to document our community than me, you know?
Amen. Thank you. And thank you for what you do there, and for what Robert has done, which is really extraordinary. I would just like to say that my art actually led to my activism. I fell in love with the landscape out here when I first came out here, and shortly thereafter realized going to the group for the South Forks, which is a local environmental organization's offices, that all of the farmland that I was photographing had already been subdivided. So our land had already been planned to be, you know, cut up and sold to the highest bidder, which made me more active in the local environmental movement. So my art led to my activism and I've grown since then. But in terms of, it's hard for me to tell. I love your expression about the DNA, but I feel too, I don't know where my art begins and my activism ends. I mean, they're just bound within me, and I feel, you know, blessed to be able to live a life where I can have them both in sort of an active dialogue. Sometimes one wins out over the other.
Yeah. So I want to come back to something, Kathryn, that you hinted at or mentioned, which is making visible what other people don't see. And that resonates for me as a rabbi. I spend a lot of time thinking about what the outsider sees, the outsider status, because in the Torah, actually, in the Hebrew Bible, the outsider is often given privileged status as seeing what insiders don't see. And the ability of someone outside the community to reflect what those who are inside don't see. So I wanted to just explore that a little bit, and I maybe start, Lola, with you. Could you speak a little bit to the function of your particular outsider status in your art? What does it offer you? Do you think it gives you an increased ability to be a change agent, and what's hard about it?
Well, I definitely say that being an outsider is my happy place. You know, it's really the only thing I know. You know, as obviously as someone who is a descendant of enslaved folks who were always thought of as outsiders, yet and still we built this country. You know, and so, but still, we're still having this outsider kind of thing, even though it's 400 years that we've been here. James Baldwin said that, I mean, I'm not quoting him exactly, but he kind of said he loves waking up, being a black queer man, you know, and so it gives you these, I guess, tools or epithets that create work. I mean, I feel like I'll never run out of ideas of what to shoot. You know what I mean? It's like I've got a plethora of things to be able to photograph, to be able to talk about, to, you know, I'm also a teacher, so I have always felt that my work could, you know, thinking back on my AIDS work, that it was a way of people, like maybe opening dialogue around some difficult subjects that people could say, oh, you know, you can't just say, oh, by the way, I have AIDS, but maybe if you saw the work, you could then get into other conversations. So it's a way of helping people communicate and learn about themselves. So I think that, yeah, I don't know anything other than it. Funnily enough, now though, I'm, you know, like they say, all of a sudden I'm getting these seats at the table. You know, I'm in East Hampton, you know. But really, like, I've not been a part of a lot of conversations for so long that I'm starting to get used to it. And also, I won't bore you guys, but I also feel like, you know, for 40 years I've kind of been under a rock, and all of a sudden this rock has been lifted, and I have a lot to say.
So you know, on that note, do you ever want to step out of that role of outsider? I mean, I know that for me as a woman rabbi, there are times when I get invited to speak about something and they want me to speak about women in Judaism. And I was like, I'll come and speak. I'm just not speaking about women in Judaism. Like you know, what I offer as a rabbi. And I know that there were writers who Robert approached who said they were willing to be photographed as a gay writer, and others who didn't want to be, and some who changed their mind. Do you ever feel pigeonholed or limited? Do you ever want to step out and not be seen through that lens?
I think that it's still early days now. I think maybe 100 years from now, people like me will be able to just present themselves in the way that they would like to. I don't think that folks like me have had the chance to stand in front of a bunch of people and talk about their work or have the work displayed in major museums. And, you know, like again, we haven't been at the table for that long. So eventually I think that people might feel the way that you do. I can't see it in my lifetime.
So I want to shift the focus just a little bit to talk about the question of empathy in art, and related to this outsider status. But I was really struck, Carlos, when I watched the Farmingville film, that one of the most extraordinary things about the film was your ability to be not only even-handed, because a good journalist can be even-handed, right? But to present empathically people who were voicing some pretty hateful views. And your ability to do that enabled the viewer to do that, which is something quite rare in these days. And I imagine that must have been hard sometimes. So I wonder first if you could just talk about what it felt like to be presenting empathically people who not only you profoundly disagreed with, but who held views that were really deeply offensive and insulting, I imagine, to you personally. And could you share with us a moment when perhaps you left something on the cutting room floor that Carlos, the man and the activist, would have loved to have included, and as a journalist, you would have loved to have laid bare, but as an artist, you knew this is not going to move the story forward?
I think thank you for that. I'm so glad that comes out in the film. It was something that we, and I say we because it was a team of people, a team of us that really worked at it and worked at it hard. But what I will take credit for is giving us a mission and a vision, which was basically could be reduced to, if you want people to listen, you have to hear. And we needed to create that common space. And this was at a time that was more hopeful around immigration. We're talking now 15 years ago. I think that there was still ways in which the national conversation was forming. And there could be that sort of middle ground to reach. And we were hopeful and optimistic about that happening. Sadly, we're seeing around us today, it didn't happen. And it's gotten much worse, and it's metastasized onto this national basis, sadly. I will say that one of the things that we strive for was to complexity. Empathy, I think, in many ways requires that kind of what comes out of nuance, out of engagement, and I guess that just in my bones, I tend to engage rather than confront. That's just me, and that I think that in very many ways enabled the film. But in filmmaking, as in any form of art, I think I find that the kind of story I want to tell, I don't want to be reductive. I want that complexity. I want that ambiguity. I want that subtlety to go in there. And I want my characters who over time become friends to be represented wholly. I don't mind taking on someone like a Sheriff Joe Arpaio and make a cartoon character out of him because he is. But someone who I may feel opposed to in terms of their political beliefs, I still want to understand what motivates them as a human being. And I can think of one anecdote about something that got left on the cutting room floor. But it had to do more with wanting to give depth rather than sort of my politics. And it was, we had a character in the state of Arizona, Kathryn Colbert. And we came across her because she was out protesting and picketing, very much in favor of SB 1070, the anti-immigrant law. And we were at her home, and she has a pickup, light pickup, covered back, and in there she carries all her protest signs that are things like 1-800-DEPORT. And we're conducting this interview with her, and she's funny and charismatic and sort of self-aware, and she delivers this line which is, "I love to picket." And the way in which she delivered it was really, really comic, and we included it in the cut of the film. And we're lucky enough to be able to show the film to a group of students at Columbia, journalism students, and they appreciated what we're doing. But that one line, they felt, really characterized her in a way that shrank her down, and therefore removed some of the complexity from the film, and eroded her as a character, and therefore eroded understanding her. So that was a line that we took out as a result of other people's response to it. So it wasn't about the politics, but rather it's about what goes into trying to shape a nuance of what a line can do in terms of that, in terms of casting someone in a different light.
You're making me think, I think sometimes when we think of activism, the image that comes to mind is of someone angry. And what you're describing is really an effort to reach out in love and respect and dignity. And I'm wondering about the role of artists in evoking that. I mean, I certainly feel that as clergy, right? There are times when as a person I'm so angry. And then I remember, and when I look through the lens of my religious tradition, it reminds me, no, I have to come from a place of love. And if I'm not doing my job. And I'm wondering, Does your role as an artist, and this is really to any of you, does it help you to be more empathic and more loving than you might be without the art as an activist?
I'm just going to take that in a moment, because as you ask that question, I'm looking at Bob's photographs.
Right.
And I'm looking at each one of these people, looking at Bob, looking into his camera, and being recognized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it took someone like Bob, who I knew and was a friend and listened dearly, it took his ability to kind of regress from himself, to allow that person to expose themselves, allow themselves to be vulnerable, to be present in that moment. And I think that to me is a definition of empathy of what art can do in terms of drawing out someone. And Lola, I think also of your characters that I've seen in your Kathryn as well as your photographs. You know, how people could look direct, how they could feel so honored, or how they can feel so recognized from what I saw of your photographs, so particularly the ones in East Kentucky. I'm sorry, in East Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Regarding empathy, to be an artist requires you to spend a lot of time being reflective. At least I'll speak for myself. And is from a place of being reflective allows you to be more open to subjects that you might be actively photographing or engaged with. I think I look at activists maybe on a picket line as being angry, but I also see a lot of activism from a lot of very soulful activists, people who have been engaged for decades and have a wellspring of deep spirituality of whatever sort works for them, enabling them to go forward with their activism. So that's kind of my one lens with which I look at activism. But getting back to empathy, I think that artists and activists are called to be empathetic. We should put ourselves in other people's shoes. And if possible, it's not always possible, of course, but I do think that it does help my activism to have had such an engagement with my art. And they, as I said earlier, they both play off each other.
So I'm empathetic with a capital E. I really can't help myself, you know, and sometimes walking along the streets of New York, it's, you know, sometimes I have to just kind of have blinders to get to work some days, you know. But yes, I mean, I always say that I see a little bit of myself in each one of my models. So I think that that's part of how I kind of am able to capture them. They trust me. It's a strange thing. I've tried to, you know, in all the various interviews I've had, I try to really like verbally explain what happens right before I click the shutter. Part of it, I think, is most of my work is done with a large 4x5 camera. And so I think just the size of that, I'm sure most of you know what that looks like. You pull, you know, you put a cloth over the camera on, and I think especially with digital technology now, with everyone sort of snapping, I'm guilty of it also, just snapping selfies all the time. So when you have this big camera in front of you, and there's Lola flash, you know, I think that people are kind of like feeling proud, and there's some kind of magic that happens. I can't really technically tell you what happens when I'm able to engage them. And sometimes they're people that I know, sometimes there's people, grandmothers, but there's possibly all of my time teaching, I think probably helps, being able to sort of suss people out. This person I need to speak louder to, this person I need to be serious with. You know, like you have to kind of like quickly suss out the person so that they're feeling that you see them or feel them. And that's kind of, I feel like, what happens when I shoot my people.
Yeah. Is there, do you ever feel that you're bucking up against the limits of empathy because the distance and difference is too great? I mean, you know, as you said earlier, like, who better than me to do this work? And we're looking at this beautiful art, and I wonder whether a straight person could have done the work that Robert Giard did. Is that possible? are there limits? Are there people you feel you can't portray? You're just too different, you can't get that connection?
You know, I sit on the fence with this question because my first thought is no. Partly because, you know, again, was it 19 is, you know,
Right.
big year, right, 400 years of us being here. And so, you know, his story was not written by me or anyone that looks like me. So it makes me feel like our story should be told by us. But with that said, my mom was a family historian, and she had a guy called Scott French, who was at the time a professor at the University of Virginia, where my great-grandfather lived, in Charlottesville. Anyway, he did a lot of research helping my mom find out information about our family there. And he was actually the head of African American Studies, and he's a white guy, so passionate about the African American history in Charlottesville. He even came to our family reunion. You know, so it's like so many things. We can't stereotype people and say you can do this and you can do that, but I guess sort of my summation of it is that I think that those people from the various communities that have not been represented in the way that they should, I think that we should be able to represent ourselves maybe first, and then the others come along. Because I mean, we grew up reading books by white people, looking at photographs of us by white people, so it only seems like it should be our turn to be able to photograph the people that we know best. So basically, I don't know. I don't know what's the answer to that question.
I would say that there's a huge and raging debate as to who controls the story, who gets to tell what story. And as Lola mentioned, many of us were excluded from stories, and I think that that's why Bob's work exists, is because he felt this community was going to fade away, a marginalized community that hadn't been at center. And I think that we do have access to stories that someone from the outside might not. And we can, I think, have a contact point that may make that more profound. And I think that we, as artists now, particularly artists of color, queer artists, have a real duty to present those voices. That said, I don't want to exclude anyone from the ability to tell a story. I don't want anyone to feel impaired from being able to have that access. I want someone to be aware that you may be outside, and therefore you need to recognize how that might interfere, what it might do. But I don't think that, I don't want to be in the role of a censor around that because of someone's identity. And I think that so many of us do have capacity, as we said before, to feel that sort of empathy, feel that common ground. And maybe now it's a reverse outsider status that can take place in there. But I don't feel that it's our as artists, we cannot draw bounds around that. We can say who we feel we can assert ourselves within that context of conversation, and we need to be there at the table, but I don't think we can exclude.
So to speak very specifically, obviously I'm a white gal, and I was walking around with the camera in Bridgehampton's African American community for several years, and I was, obviously acutely, or not obviously, I was acutely aware of the fact that I was an outsider. I was approached by the Historical Museum to do the project, and because I had been an activist in the community, and I knew a number of people in the community, but I was not of the community. So what I decided to do to approach the project was, first of all, a great deal of just listening and being present and observing. I really didn't take many pictures for a few months, as I went to a lot of church services, I went to a lot of community meetings, and just introduced myself to those who I didn't know and told them about the project. The project the portfolio that I put together is not the same as perhaps a person of color would have put together. But I was also very much aware that the community had a very controversial relationship to this other Hampton essay that had been done. And I was informed that people did not want to be photographed in front of a broken window, which I totally get and I understand. I think that the other Hampton, without wanting to do that, ended up doing that. So within my own boundaries of being a privileged white woman and living on the East End, I endeavored to push myself to try to engage in whatever empathy I could. And, you know, again, as a white person, I'm an insider. There's just no question about that. As a gay white person, I have some little brush with what it's like to feel the sting of prejudice. So I did make an effort to try to let the people, to listen to the people, to have their dignity come forward, and to try to create an essay that would show the iconic resoluteness, determination, and lovingness that existed in the community.
Could I ask a question? Because in this question around representation and access and who photographs, who tells a story, Lola, I was really fascinated and I loved your photographs, particularly because they're a large format, because they are formal, because they sort of elevate the subject. And I wonder if you could maybe talk to why you chose to do that as opposed to something less formal or another approach. And I know as documentary filmmakers, it's something that we constantly struggle with.
Do you mean the surpassing series or just
It was
with the white background? Or?
I think background, yeah, but it was white background.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So that one's called Surmise, and it's about basically gender fluid folks. Yeah. So I started it. Well, there's lots of different things, but let me see if I can make sense of it all. I photograph against a white background, and really kind of almost like normal lighting, like there's not really any dramatic lighting. And I specifically did that because I didn't want to, light can be so alluring. And I mean, that's why us photographers like light. But at the same time, I didn't want to create these, alluring pictures to that, so that the light would then be what people were being drawn in by. I wanted it to be just really stark. So it's like almost in the way that maybe a scientist would work. They're very kind of like, just the people are standing there. And so that's part of the whole reason why I just really wanted to, and even like my SALT series, a lot of my work, I really work towards not making really alluring lighting, because I'm really thinking about these more as kind of documentation of our community, and I don't want anything to sway it, because you could sway the light to make someone look more girl-like or more guy-like or whatever, you know what I mean? I sometimes play around with posing if I want to. So that particular series, because of the way I look, I'm female presenting. I've always, since I was a little girl, I always wore boys' clothes. So now I say I wear masculine clothes, and my parents were fine with it. Right? Because of the way that I dress and because of my short hair, pretty much every day someone says "sir" to me, which doesn't bother me as long as they serve me. I'm fine. As long as they pick me up from a cab, then I'm fine with that. But just the idea that people are always assuming. And so there's queer folks in that series, but then there's also some straight people. So I have a couple of friends who are married, a guy and a girl, and they have a lot of gay friends. But when they hang out with their gay friends, everyone thinks they're also gay. So it's just really interesting, who you hang around with and how people then decide who you are. And now it seems really odd to me because so many women now have short hair because it's just easier, right? Not because they're queer, because it's just easier. Guys now, can wear their hair long, and it's not any kind of, straight guys, and gay guys do it too. So it seems odd to me now in the 21st century that people are still looking at these certain codes that to me seem so old-fashioned and still coming up with the same kind of thing. But then with that said, sometimes I do it too, right? You're busy, you're in the back of someone, you see long hair, and you just immediately think girl. So, you know, I think as an artist, I'm always, and as a teacher, I'm always looking at my own biases. I'm always thinking like, were you being biased then? You know, immediately if I don't see a black person in an ad, I'm like, oh, they're racist. You know what I mean? It's like, it's not always the case. So, yeah, so it depends upon the series, but generally, like in my Surpassing series, that's one on rooftops. That one in particular, just before I click the shutter, I tell people to think about pride and power, and to think about someone that they admire. So I think in all my series, I do say I do coach people a little bit on what kind of expression I want them to have, because I want them to look assertive but not aggressive. The whole idea of the gaze also in my work is very important because, again, back towards slavery days, we weren't allowed to look at massa, right? So just looking at a person, a white person, you could have been killed, right? Whistling was another, terrible thing to do, and you could get killed for that. So the gaze is very important in my work. So, again, not being aggressive, being assertive. So I went around the world on that one, but
I appreciate it.
yeah.
Can I make a comment about that? First of all, I really want to urge everybody to look at Lola's website because the work is really astonishing. And she is working with, and I won't get very technical, but she is using a large view camera, which is not an easy way in which to engage with people. It's not like having a 35mm camera, so there's a lot of setup, there's a lot of artistry and technique to be able to get that. And the light in your work is quite beautiful, so I'm actually surprised to hear you say that you are kind of downplaying the light, because I think the light is quite stunning. Anyway, I just wanted to offer that, and to, for those of you out there with your digital camera or with your point and shoot, it's just like a whole universe of increased difficulty to be working with a view camera. So, bravo.
Yes, ditto. So as we're talking about that, how you draw out a particular gaze from a subject, circling back to something that's been a theme ongoingly about art as a form of activism in the sense of altering who, what, and how we see. Whether it's making visible people or experiences who are usually completely unseen, as you talked about, Kathryn, and I was really moved by your Assault series, Lola, this is a series of women in their 70s who are actively, passionately engaged in their life's work, and that's definitely a demographic that is often just not seen. Or whether we're talking about defamiliarization and estrangement of familiar common things that enable them to be seen in a new way. Or art, as you've talked about, revealing humanity, dignity, and beauty that the average eye might miss. I was really moved. Jonathan told me a story of a particular subject that Robert had photographed, who responded by saying that she was really taken aback when she saw the photo because she felt that he had seen something in her that no one had ever seen before. And I wanted to ask the three of you, do you struggle at all with the line between intimacy with your subjects and intrusiveness? Like, do you ever feel that you're seeing something that you're not sure you should show? Or is that just the sweet spot where you want to be, is seeing that thing in someone that no one else has seen?
I've got two ways to answer that question. One is, I think that what we all have done through our work is to bring the marginal into the center. Mm-hmm. And in so doing, I think that our subjects may be seeing themselves represented for the first time. I know that in the screenings of, particularly my film, A Class Apart, which focused on a 1950s landmark civil rights decision involving the Mexican-American community from the Southwest, little unknown case. that when that gets shown in the Southwest, and I've been at screenings, people have cried because of that recognition and not having seen their images before. So there's that aspect of it. But in terms of the line of intimacy, the sad and ironic truth as a documentary filmmaker is that our films exist on other people's tragedies and conflict. And so when something happens, we were kind of sadistically happy in a weird way because something has happened. I'm making light of it, but there's a certain degree of truth to that. That said, also though, there are certain times when you do want to veer the eye. Usually not in the fragile, for me, not in the fragile, intimate moments because people know the camera is running and they have given us some license in there. And I think that they want their stories to be told and represented even in that moment. But it can sometimes be the political. Someone making a comment about how their family did agree to cross the border and ended up taking advantage of social benefits. You know, that may not be included in the film. That's something that I personally sensitive, but you know, it's that moment of intimacy and what do I want to show, what do I want to frame, how do I want to tell the story.
So two thoughts. One is a series I haven't mentioned, which is called Crooked Knee, which was documenting my father's last year of life. And so I had the camera ever present in our family's journey there. And there were many times when I struggled with whether or not I should be behind the camera at particular moments. But it, you know, there is always the tension, you know, that Carlos mentions about, you know, getting something that will serve a greater good versus feeling like there may be some invasion of privacy. With the project that I did, Life Along the Turnpike, I made a lot of family visits with the church who would visit elderly individuals who are often infirmed. And you know, I was photographing with a 2 1/4 camera, which is not as bulky as a 4x5, but it's also something that needed a tripod often in order to be able to get photographs. And so I was I tried very hard to be as, I mean, I think that this is also what better photographers than I do, you become invisible in the space, in the sense that you kind of move like a cat around the room and you try to almost fade away so that the people, it's not like they don't know that you're there, but there is a certain dropping of guard that does happen after a while that I've experienced, that I know other much better photographers than I are able to have happen and therefore to be able to get the shot. But the home visits to the elderly were particularly moving and nuanced, and funerals as well that I photographed were difficult and required, you know, mature choices about when to be present and when to step away.
I'm wondering also, along these lines, I think we're all familiar with certain photographs that come to symbolize something, like a moment. You know, I'm thinking about that photograph of the child covered with dust, right, and the Syrian refugee crisis. Are you ever concerned about the danger of turning people and their pains and experience into a metaphor or a symbol? Or, to put it another way, about romanticizing suffering in the course of bringing out beauty and dignity. Can you ever think of an example where you were struggling with that, or that kind of tension emerged for you?
Can I do something really quickly?
Please.
All right. So when I talk about my work, I like to show sort of optical illusions. So everyone's seen this sign, right? How many of you know the symbol that's in here? Yeah, it's the arrow, right? So some of you know the arrow. So just for quickness sakes, the arrow is in between the E and the X.
Oh.
Right? So when you look at this next time, you'll think of me. No, you won't be able to look at this now without seeing the arrow. So my point being that for someone from like pretty much every marginalized community that there is, I wish. You know, it's interesting to look at my work, because what's starting to happen now is that many of my models are showing up in different series. So, you know, there's a series about older women, there's a series about gender fluid people, there's a series about skin pigmentation. And so they're starting to turn up in different ones, which is interesting to me, because it's not, I mean, it shows that we're not like just this monolithic story. So for people in marginalized communities, I think that's one of the things that I'm hoping to do, is to uplift us to show the various different things, you know, like, you know, I'm not bragging, but I have 2 masters. Now, walking down the street when people look at me and think, there's a girl with 2 masters, you know what I mean? So just to try to like change those stories. And that's one of the things I also liked about Robert's work, is that he obviously he really was intent on photographing people of different ages, people of different colors, people of different sexes. So I think that he, like myself, understands the importance of not reproducing history in the way that many other artists have. I mean, you think of Mapplethorpe. I mean, only time he photographed black men was to sort of like over-sexualize them. Right. You know, I love the flowers that he did, but I think there's a lot of photographers who I won't mention who just photographed their communities, and I don't know if it was fear or what, but as people who, I mean, the older I get now, I feel like I'm a documentarian looking at some of my pictures of like people with Walkmans, for instance. You know, it's like, I didn't think, oh, I'm going to throw this Walkman in the picture, and you know, in the 21st century, people are going to be like, look how clever she is. You know, it's just kind of like those things that just happen, right? I never thought about myself in that way. I always thought I was a fine artist. But again, just thinking about the parallel with our work, it's really kind of neat to be here speaking about it. I'd like to thank you also.
So I want to make sure to leave some time for questions. I saw one hand already. So let me just ask one more question before we open it up. I remember reading, Stephen Sondheim once noted that before there was amplification in theaters, the audience had to really lean in and listen. You know, even to the biggest, you know, even to Ethel Merman, you had to lean in order to attend and listen, and that affected the way the audience experienced the play. But now the audience sort of sits back and and says they want the theater and the art to come to them. And I wonder, is there an equivalent in our day with visual art? Has the extreme oversharing and the exposure of social media affected the impact of what's revealed by art and affected the way you think people see your art? Is it different now than it used to be?
No, I think that yes, it does affect the way we communicate. It affects the way we receive information. I think that as a documentary filmmaker, one of the things that's happening is that things are getting more and more reductive. I mean, you're getting down to shorter and shorter films. If you want something to be seen, it's got to be 30 seconds for social media, 3 minutes maybe for something that's more engaged. And I do think that the way in which we, obvious statement, the way in which we interact through our phones is being jeopardized and compromised. At the same time, I think that technology, and that's a result of technology. At the same time, technology has enabled an awful lot in terms of telling stories. And I think that my films would not have been possible without a small camera that was affordable and could get us in and out of places. But I think also, oddly enough, as we're going into these smaller and smaller bites of storytelling and experience, we're also going into larger and larger and more expansive formats of storytelling, such as in series, television series, episodic storytelling, where these creators have the ability to do Tolstoy on television. I mean, they can really go in and just unravel the story, a character over time, and take us in that lengthy exposition. And we're all reveling in it, obviously, because everyone is, when you go to a party, everyone's talking about what are you watching now, as opposed to what are you reading. So I think that there is at the same time that we're becoming withdrawing and getting accustomed to these small bits of ways of communicating the story, I think we're also, there's something deeper in us that's calling for that old-fashioned storytelling in a different format, but still wanting that same sort of long arc and ability to luxuriate characters.
So I'm just thinking now, if we're having this discussion a century ago, we'd be discussing painting versus photography and how is photography changing painting. I mean, we always go through a transition of tools or of the trade to use as artists to try to bring awareness of subjects to our audience. And we are going through, I guess, a potentially big shift now with what's happening with the technology. But ironically, we have someone working with a 4x5 view camera and a 2 1/4 camera, which are almost dinosaurs at this point in time. But still, I think they give greater power to the image because of the fact, because just the act of using those tools creates something different than if you were using your cell phone. So I'll just put that out there. And I guess I see it as a wonderful and horrible challenge as an artist. It's wonderful because we're challenged to try to make a photograph that someone hasn't made before, okay? We're trying to do something that's different, and when everyone has a cell phone and makes 1,000 pictures every day, that becomes harder and harder. But I reflect personally on my most recent series, which I call Witness, which is photographing wrapped shrubs. You may not be familiar with this, Lola, coming from Brooklyn, but believe it or not, it's going to be hard for you to believe, but people in the winter wrap their shrubs out here, and it's become kind of an epidemic. It's just started in the last 5 or 6 years. And I mean, to me, it became the perfect metaphor on many levels for the fact that we were wrapped up in ourselves, that we were hiding the landscape, we were taking aggressive possession of the landscape, and so something that just appeared in the landscape became, for me as an artist, a great way of using my craft to do something different. So everything's out there. There's an infinity of images for us to draw upon, and I think so that's where I'm coming from. I think we just use what we can and we go forward.
Yeah, well, I think the same way, like, we're sitting in a room full of photographers, right? All you guys are photographers. You got your cameras on your phone, and I think that it's interesting because it's almost like I was thinking about how music, with music maybe we all can't sing, but we sing along to the songs. We dance or we pat our, so there's like this kind of communion with the musician. And so in that same way that now when we're speaking to audiences, like everyone has an idea about taking a picture that we didn't have before. So it's like you're a more informed audience. Maybe a little bit more of our struggles, or like when I'm teaching my kids, I say to them to edit the picture. I used to have to explain what editing means, but they know how to edit, they know what saturation is, you know, contrast, all those kinds of things I used to have to like to teach exactly. Now those kinds of words, they already know. So yeah, I was just thinking like just in the long run, I think it's great because we all need an audience either in the gallery or at our panel, and to have a more informed audience is kind of cool, you know, so I think it's, you know, there's a lot of good things about it, and I love Instagram. I love the fact that I can just put stuff up about my shows and stuff. But with that said, you know, like my last show I had in London, my pictures are usually 4 foot by 5 foot, most of my series, and so to see people really slow down and really read the images, I think that really is an interesting contrast to the way we're flicking through images that way. But then when you have the actual image in front of you to see, especially the young folks, stop and have a look. It's an interesting kind of way.
I wanted to ask you just one last question, and that is, the work you do is really not easy. And whether it's making art or whether it's being an activist with the art or out or in other ways, it's long-term work that often doesn't yield immediate reward, and we all know it doesn't always pay very well. And certainly combining both is hard. And I wondered if each of you could just briefly share with us what sustains you, what keeps you doing this work, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't pay, even when the activism doesn't seem to be making a difference and the art you're not sure is going to be seen or appreciated for what you wanted it to say. What keeps you going?
I guess for me, it's a matter of self-preservation in some ways. With Farmingville, I saw a headline that said they wanted to get two Mexican day laborers, two Mexicans, and that for me just pushed me over the brink. So it's that motivation, but it's also just an itch that sometimes gets in there that can't be scratched without moving and doing something about it.
Well, for me, it's to ensure that the young folks that are coming out to see examples of themselves. You know, even now, there's more and more photographers or artists of color that are in museums. And when I go to the shows, you know, I get so excited, and I think to myself, wow, if I was a little kid going to museums, what would that have been like for me to go to these museums, to MoMA, to the Met, and see myself up there? How would that have changed me? You know, maybe I wouldn't feel the need to always photograph people that look like me. You know, maybe I could just photograph a flower, you know. But I mean, that's not to say that there's anything wrong with that, but you know, I always, ever since I was an activist, when I would blow out my candles for my birthday, I would always wish for an end for AIDS, you know, and I got into my 40s, and I was just like, wow, it's still going on, you know, and I thought, well, you know, even an activist needs a vacation, you know, so I started doing landscapes, but even in my landscapes, I saw like boundaries and borders. It was really hard for me to kind of turn my political head off, but yeah, that's about the size of it.
Well, I think, I mean, I do what I do because I have a passion for it, and it's just something, it's bred in the bone. I couldn't not do it. But what sustains me, well, first of all, I just want to say, if anyone in the audience hasn't seen Farmingville, you should absolutely watch it. It's an extraordinary documentary.
It's on iTunes. It's available.
It's on iTunes. It's available. Having lived in the community during that time, it's a beautiful work that you've done. And you know, I think of Bob Giard's work on the walls in terms of, you know, for the gay people, the young gay people in the 90s who saw these. Wow, there's gay writers. Wow, I never know that. Or, you know, I mean, as a kid, I, you know, would often wonder, you know, if there was ever a movie with a gay person, it would be like, wow, you know, there's maybe one, you know. So it's so helpful to have role models. It's so important for you, for what you're doing for the young people. And that's the youth going forward. So I'd also like to say that community sustains me in terms of my activism. While we've lived through an incredibly, difficult time, possibly the most challenging ones, in our recent history, one of the richest rewards in the activism has been the people that I've met and the people that have come together. So that sustains me. I also am a person of faith. Faith sustains me throughout the work that I do. And just seeing the great, as a white person of privilege, seeing the great injustice and suffering around me doesn't sustain me, but it calls me to do the heck something about it.
So we began with the capacity of art to hold loss. And I think where you've taken us is the capacity of art to hold and inspire hope. And you've certainly, all three of you have filled me with hope just listening to you talk and the way that you talk about your empathy for the other and your commitment to doing the work that you do in the world. And so I want to re-highlight and re-emphasize, please go to each of their websites and look at their art. And we'll have some time now to spend a little more time with Robert's art and to see the hopefulness that he captured in these faces, even at a time of difficulty and loss. So thank you so much, all three of you, and thank you again, Jonathan, for putting this together. And thank all of you.